Starting off, I wanted to ask, what is Eurocentrism? What is Afrocentrism? And I was hoping you could expand to explain these isms, how they have impacted scholarship, and are they similar or are they completely different?
Yeah, so Eurocentrism is basically the water we swim in. If you function in a university setting, or if you've ever gone to school, you're sort of functioning in a Eurocentric world. That is that all of our history and our literature and our perspectives are funneled through the European Enlightenment, essentially. And the way we view the ancient world in particular has been usurped through that Enlightenment narrative. The way the ancient world was understood was very different before the European Enlightenment. And there were lots of different centers for intellectualism and centers for knowledge. But in the United States, we sort of function through this very much Enlightenment, European, really Germanic, right? So, I mean, the modern university in the US is structured on the German university, the Humboldtian sort of idea. Then, so that's really Eurocentrism. Is basically our perspectives are all driven through that. Take a philosophy class, take a political science class, look at economics, this idea that there are other perspectives and other centers of knowledge. The fact that we call the ancient world, but we really mean Greece and Rome, and maybe some Egypt or some, Persians thrown in there is Eurocentric, right? And those things are only thrown in there because, as we'll talk about later, there is a large tendency of history since the 1830s, roughly, of claiming those as European cultures, and particularly white cultures. Afrocentrism it emerged in the 20th century as a sort of counterweight, a way to basically try to decenter that narrative and show that there are these other traditions, and specifically to reclaim some of the history of the world as actual African history. So Diop is kind of like, one of the most famous Afrocentrists. And in terms of how this connects to the ancient world, most of the claims are that, Greek and Roman civilizations and what we call Western civilization is actually rooted in Egyptian, which is a Black African culture. We can talk about the validity of that side of the theory as well. Are they the same thing, Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism? No. They're fundamentally different things. One is a response to the other. One is a sort of, one is the center and the dominant voice, and the other one is a sort of marginalized, trying to sort of push its way in. Anthony Appiah actually sort of views them as two sort of extreme aspects of the same thing, but I think he's wrong in that he gives Afrocentrism way too much weight versus Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism, as far as I'm concerned, is the norm against which we tend to weigh everything else. And when you're the norm, you can't be put on one side of a scale. You're actually the thing that keeps the scale balanced. And that's a structural difference. So I wouldn't say they're the same thing. One is clearly a voice in the wilderness, and one of them is the sort of central dominant voice in all of academic and historical discourses in Europe, in America, the United States. I'm not going to speak for what's happening in Germany or France or the UK. I'll speak for the US. But obviously, if you're European, you're probably Eurocentric. Look at the British today. They're British centric. Scots don't even count anymore, right? So I don't think they're very much the same thing in terms of how all these isms have impacted scholarship. Until scholars actually became willing, and some are still unwilling, to evaluate that they have any ism attached to them, they carry lots of weight. It's the unexamined ism that has power, because it pretends to not exist and it pretends to be neutral. And when it does that, then it actually tilts the scales dramatically, and it is the water that you swim in, and it is not recognized for what it is. You can only combat racism or sexism or white supremacism if you actually define it and see it. If you're unwilling to see it, you actually are it, and you're enacting it all the time without being able to. It prevents objectivity. I think objectivity is always completely impossible. It's completely impossible to be completely objective, but you can get closer to objectivity if you can recognize your own biases. And if you are unwilling to examine those things and admit that they exist, you can't recognize them, and so you can't be objective. So insofar as white supremacism and racism and sexism and Eurocentrism continue to impact and dominate our scholarship and control how we ask our questions, it is immensely powerful. And it's only been in the last few decades that scholars have actually stepped back and said, oh, maybe despite my best efforts, I have biases. And maybe I should understand what those biases are, because then when I go look at my ancient texts, I can say, oh, that's actually not what the text says. That's me projecting my modern bias. So that's what I would really say we have to be careful of. And that's actually the core of the work that I try to do.